Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with another deck overview for the modern format. As a friendly reminder, if you do like these informative modern overviews, please consider subscribing to the channel, give me a thumbs up, leave me a constructive comment down below. So for today's deck overview, we're looking at one of the more maligned tribal strategies within the modern format. Now obviously tribal strategies have not been at their best for quite some time, especially since the printing of Modern Horizons 2. Previous to that, things such as humans, spirits, merfolk, elves, all those would pop up on occasion, although even elves would sometimes struggle from time to time. The rest of these decks would pop up from time and time again, and would be quite successful strategies, but with the implementation of things like Fury and Solitude and Prismatic Ending and March of Otherworldly Light and Unholy Heat, and all these just more and more efficient removal spells, it's become progressively harder to play a true creature-based deck that doesn't have some type of resilience. Now, Merfolk does not necessarily have resilience in the traditional sense, things like undying creatures out of Golgari Yawgmoth, or the disruption of things like Thalia or Meddling Mage, or some of these things that you see out of the decks that you'll see pop up now and again, or things like Hammer Time with protection spells and such. What it does, however, is kind of like this amalgamation of the humans tribal deck with the ability to pump its creatures obnoxiously large, with a little bit of disruption, with kind of this tempo-y, tricky nonsense that a deck like Spirits kind of implements against the more controlling decks, and makes it really punishing for those decks to kind of play expensive spells, for things like Omnath, or for things like Fury, or these cards, they play things that make those cards very difficult to resolve. Merfolk's kind of somewhere in the middle. The biggest problem with the deck is most of the power of the deck comes at the 2-drop slot. If you just look at the mana curve of the different variants that we'll be going through, you see a ton of 2-drops in the deck, including the newest thing, which is a Voldalian Hexcatcher. But the deck has a glut of 2-drops, so it's a little bit slower than your typical aggressive deck would be in the modern format. To kind of make up for that, you do have this kind of like tempo, over-the-top plan, and probably the single strongest card in the deck is actually Aether Vial, or at least the first copy of Aether Vial. This allows the deck to kind of get ahead on mana over the course of the game. Allows you to resolve your spells through counter spells. Along with Cavern of Souls, it makes it very difficult for counterspell to be a reliable answer to answering any of these creatures. However, obviously, the answers of that card has increased over time. Things like Force of Vigor, Prismatic Ending, Leyline Binding, all these things, once again, make this card a little bit more difficult to keep in play, get advantage off of. But that is kind of where this deck draws its power, this ability to kind of play a bunch of lords, kill your opponent out of nowhere, potentially give themselves island walk, and then just you're unable to block and they kill you. Beyond that, you're playing things like Tide Shaper, which when it's kicked can turn something into an island, so you no longer need to play something like Spreading Seas necessarily, although you certainly can if you want to have a little bit more disruption against decks like Urza's Saga, or decks like Valakut or Tron, which really aren't a huge part of the format right now. Curse Catcher has historically always been Fish's #1 go-to 1-drop, and this is kind of like this force spike effect, much like a Mausoleum Wanderer, although it doesn't scale with its power, unfortunately, but still gives you a little bit of power along with it. And then you have your traditional lords, Lord of Atlantis, Master of the Pearl Trident, both give island walk to your creatures. Lord of Atlantis can be a bit tricky in the Merfolk Mirror, which obviously doesn't pop up very much, but it gives all of Merfolk island walk, which can be problematic. But, with all these 4 or 5 color decks, you often find yourselves having the ability to land walk. And the newest, Voldalian Hexcatcher recently replaced the 3-drop Lord, which is kind of Mira Reidri was the card that used to see play, that you kind of get ahead on mana by casting spells and such. But this one is a Flash Lord that also turns all of your Merfolk into Curse Catchers, which can kind of catch your opponent out of nowhere, and just kind of adds to the overall disruption that this deck has access to. Silvergill Adept is a little bit of form of card advantage as long as you reveal another Merfolk. It's basically a 2-1 draw card, Elvish Visionary with upside, basically. And then Merfolk Trickster makes combat a little bit difficult for opponent's creatures, allows you to kind of tap down a creature out of nowhere, potentially add another power to the board, or source of power to the board during your opponent's end step, once again allowing you to kind of continue to play this flash game. Sfe'loon is another recent addition for Modern Horizons 2. It's indestructible as long as you control 2 other Merfolk, gives your other Merfolk ward 1, so it gives you a little bit of disruption. Although, something to note with things like Ether Vial and stuff is this does have to be in play when the spell is cast for ward to take effect. It cannot happen after the spell is cast to try to counter it in some weird way. A couple copies of Dismember in this build as a way of removal spells. One thing that blue-based decks kind of do lack is the ability to remove creatures quite easily. But you do have some tempo ways, and then you also have 4 copies of Subtlety in a mono blue deck. Might buy you a little bit of time by putting an Omnath back on top of your opponent's deck, maybe putting a Fury on top of their deck. Especially in the mid to late game, you can actually hard cast this and really force your opponent and kind of tempo them out in those kind of game plans in the middle. Beyond that, you also get to play a land base that includes 4 copies of Mutavault to be able to pressure your opponent further and kind of build on those tribal strategies. And then, sideboard, you take a look at the weaknesses of a tribal deck. Obviously, things like Relic of Progenitus for any type of, living end or dredge nonsense, as that can definitely be a problematic strategy for this type of thing. Harbinger of the Tides for other creature-based decks allows you to interact with opponent's creatures, much like Dismember. This buys you a little bit of time, along with Dismember, allows you to deal with your opponent's creatures. Force of Negation when you need a little bit of disruption for your mid-range control or combo opponents. 3 copies of Chalice. This is primarily here for decks like Living End, decks like Teamer 5-color, whatever flavor it's running right now, Rhinos, Glimpse combo, but can also come in against decks like Burn and such, as you have the ability to play most of your Merfolk through Cavern of Souls if you happen to lock down on one. And beyond your first Ether Vial, you generally don't want it. So Chalice is yet another card for another form of disruption in those decks, which gives you kind of this backup plan. And Orvar is tech that I've seen out of some of the 3 and 4 color piles. This is primarily tech for problematic the creativity matchup, because this allows you to discard it to Archon of Cruelty, and then it comes into copies Archon, and then even if your opponent has, like, say, a second Archon, you get to, like, untap, attack into it, and then force them to sack it. So Orvar is kind of the nice tech against creativity that a lot of these decks have been doing. So it is nice to see that another mono blue deck is picking this tech up for those particular style of matchups. So this version's a little bit different, but it is a 5-0 list within the last couple weeks by noted Merfolk aficionado Nikachu, who has his own YouTube channel and is quite a celebrity within the Magic community. But you see a lot of 4-ofs in this list, which I think is quite nice and cleaner. You're seeing 4 of Curse Catcher, 4 of Tide Shaper, 4 of Ether Vial. You're no longer seeing things like the Spreading Seas. You're no longer having to play these weird kind of bad cards to enable your strategies. You're actually doing it attached to a body, which is quite nice. 4 copies of Dismember, quite nice, just to deal with your opponent's creatures. Once again, you're dealing with a monocolored mana base, so while taking a little bit of damage for Dismember isn't great, but it is nice to kill opponent's Omnaths, potentially kill their opponent's Ledger Shredders, etc. Just dealing with your opponent's creatures. Say they block your creature, you shrink its size down, say they have a Death Shadow or something. It is quite nice to have access to this. Beyond that, you're still seeing a lot of the same cards. 4 copies of Sfe'loon, 4 copies of Lord of Atlantis. Basically, this is just a tribal deck that just pumps its creatures and has a little bit of disruption as far as what's going on, tempoing your opponent with things like Merfolk Trickster and stuff. Sideboard, the aforementioned 4 copies of Spreading Seas. Once again, there's a lot of these like 4 and 5 color decks that are loading up on these triomes and really relying on like one triome, one shock land to get all their things. Say you Spreading Seas your opponent's say Savai triome for some reason. All of a sudden they have an island where they had 3 other land types before. You can really disrupt and kind of screw with your opponent's mana a little bit, especially as you're trying to kind of tempo them out with, say, an Ether Vial, getting some of your Lords down. Fortification, we've already kind of talked about its place in the meta. Subtlety and Chalice of the Void. I'm really a huge fan of, even what I would consider a master of the archetype, playing a lot of 4-ofs in their sideboard, kind of the old Japanese sideboarding style, of Spreading Seas, Force of Negation, Subtlety, and then a couple of Chalices for the problematic matchups. Now, we've already kind of talked about the problems that a lot of these tribal decks have in the format overall. The plethora of removal, the plethora of disruption for creature-based decks, even without cards like Supreme Verdict or different types of sweepers like Anger of the Gods and such, seeing a bunch of play. Although blue-white is a little bit on the rise, this is certainly a deck that can play enough of a flash game to kind of give blue-white control a little bit of fits. The biggest problem with this deck overall, at least in my experience, having played it a little bit, what most people may not know is obviously I'm primarily known as a bird mage in terms of modern decks that I've played. But the very first modern deck I actually owned was Merfolk. I played it in one event and then immediately sold it. It was miserable to me. I didn't enjoy the playstyle at the time, and I really didn't understand what Merfolk was all about. Obviously, that's been many years ago, and there's been a lot of powerful Merfolk printed since then, but the core of the deck remains a problem. You have this weird tension of a bunch of 2-drop creatures, a bunch of... you're playing all these islands, but you have like these weird hands of like island plus Mutavault, and then all these like blue lords you can't keep. Or so you have a hand of like 4 lords, a couple of lands, and a dismember. You have these weird hands where it's like you're going to struggle to get all your spells into play in a relevant time frame sometimes. And a lot of times your opponent can just like pick off one creature at a time, especially if you don't have an Ether Vial or Force of Negation to kind of back it all up. So like I said, while this deck can be very tricky, and a Merfolk Master or a person who is fairly good with tempo strategies can do fairly reasonably well with this deck in kind of a more open modern format right now, this is certainly a deck that has some limitations and some drawbacks as far as what it's capable of, simply because the mana curve is so relatively high for a creature-based deck. If you look at a deck like Elves, they're often running like 12 1-drop Elves, they're mana dorks. You often see humans when they're seeing playing things like Champion of the Parish, Ether Vial. Sometimes they play mana dorks like Noble Hierarch to kind of get ahead on stuff. And so it's really about learning how to be able to double spell what hands are keepable with this deck, and you can have a lot of fun and success with the deck. And it's much like a deck like Spirits. It is this kind of blue tempo based deck that, while not quite as good as something like Murktide, is still quite interesting in the format. And a lot of people just don't have the reps against something like Merfolk anymore, as it's really not a deck you see it pop up a lot in leagues or big events anymore. So it's a deck, if you have it in your back pocket, can be a deck that can spike a tournament just simply because of the unfamiliarity of the play patterns of a deck like this. But it is a tribal based deck that is in the format you should be aware of. And if you like the kind of content like that, there is Nikachu. There's a few other people that have done Merfolk content over the years. I believe there's a newer YouTuber that's been doing Merfolk content. I forget her name off the top of my head. Watched a couple of her videos for some background information about the deck. But it is a deck that is very powerful, but a little bit its power has kind of slipped in terms of relative to the rest of the format. Tribal decks all have kind of struggled, but it has gotten a new card in Bodillion Hexcatcher, so might be a deck worth checking out if you like blue-based tempo and are sick of playing at Murktide. As always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hope to see you for the next video.